The iPhone 14 is in an interesting spot in 2025, and in this video, we're going to use the iPhone 14 throughout the day while we talk about the phone and its current value proposition in comparison to the other iPhones Apple is selling. We'll take some photos and videos on the phone, and overall see how it holds up in 2025. So the iPhone 14 was released pretty recently, back in fall 2022, and it only being a couple years old, it of course looks very similar to the newer generation iPhone 15 and iPhone 16. It features the same 6.1-inch display size with flat aluminum sides and a glass back. The iPhone 14's display is great. It features an OLED panel with a pixel density of 460 pixels per inch, it has a 60Hz display refresh rate, and a peak brightness of 800 nits in typical situations and up to 1200 nits when viewing HDR content. These display specifications are almost the exact same as the newer iPhone 15 and iPhone 16's display specs. The only distinguishable advantage the iPhone 15 and iPhone 16's displays have over the iPhone 14's display is the peak brightness level. The latest iPhone 15 and iPhone 16 having a peak brightness of 1000 nits in typical situations, up to 1600 nits when viewing HDR content, and up to 2000 nits when outdoors. But honestly, the only time you'd ever notice the iPhone 14 being a bit dimmer would be outside in direct sunlight. So you're getting a fantastic display on the iPhone 14. There's only a couple things some people might take issue with, the first of which being that the iPhone 14 has the notch style area at the top of the display to house the front camera, the speaker, and some other sensors, as opposed to the dynamic island cutout to house these things that the newer iPhone 15 and 16 have, which does look a bit more refined. In my experience though, the notch or island area just kind of disappears when I actually use my phone, so I don't think it's a big deal at all. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, the dynamic island area on the newer iPhone 15 and 16 can display live activities around it, which is nice. However, you basically get the very same experience with the live activities on the iPhone 14 and older on the lock screen. So you're really not missing much there in actuality. And also, the iPhone 14, it does not have a ProMotion 120Hz display refresh rate. It again has a maximum 60Hz display refresh rate. So scrolling into animations won't look quite as smooth as they do on Apple's Pro tier iPhones. However, the latest standard tier iPhone 16 still also has a maximum 60Hz display refresh rate. So besides the Pro tier line, even the latest standard tier iPhones still lack 120Hz ProMotion displays. So it's not a downside exclusive to the iPhone 14 here. The iPhone 14 features two 12-megapixel main and ultra-wide lenses on the back, and of course we have a front-facing camera that's also 12 megapixels. It should go without saying, an iPhone that's only a couple generations old will take stellar photos and videos, and that's certainly the case with the iPhone 14 here. Something worth noting though is that the newer iPhone 15 and 16 feature a higher 48-megapixel main lens, as opposed to the 12-megapixel main lens that the iPhone 14 has. This is going to be most noticeable when you zoom in on a photo you've taken. You'll notice the iPhone 15 and 16's photos do have more sharpness and detail than the iPhone 14 has. It's not a huge deal, but it is a noticeable improvement with the newer iPhone 15 and 16. And also, thanks to this 48 megapixel main lens, the newer iPhone 15 and 16 get optical 2x zoom, where the iPhone 14 here can still do 2x zoom, but it's digital, not optical. So it won't be quite as sharp, but it still looks perfectly fine, as you can see. And speaking of zoom, the maximum digital zoom for photos on the iPhone 14 is 5x, where on the newer iPhone 15 and 16, it's 10x, once again, thanks to that higher 48 megapixel main lens. And in terms of the ultra-wide lens, 0.5x shots taken on the iPhone 14 look fantastic. I'm not noticing any distinguishable difference between the iPhone 14 and the 15 and 16. Same thing goes with front-facing photos. And besides lacking that higher 48 megapixel main lens, the only other camera change you're missing out on that the newer iPhone 15 and 16 have is the new Smart HDR5 image processing system. You only get Smart HDR4 on the iPhone 14 here. Smart HDR5 offers photo quality with improved contrast and color, but honestly, it's not going to make a huge difference and might not even be noticeable depending on your shooting conditions. Here's some 4K 60 frames per second video shot on the iPhone 14, 15, and 16. You'd be pretty hard pressed to notice any real difference between the iPhone 14, 15, and 16 in most shooting conditions. As I often say, I think video in particular is one of the iPhone's strongest areas. And by the way, the maximum digital zoom for video on the iPhone 14 is 3 3 times, and on the newer iPhone 15 and 16, it's 6 times. The difference here, again, being a result of the newer iPhone 15 and 16 having that higher 48 megapixel main lens. So the cameras on the iPhone 14 are very solid in 2025. Even though you miss out on that higher 48 megapixel main lens that the newer iPhone 15 and 16 have, the 12 megapixel main lens in the iPhone 14 here provides more than enough quality for 90% of iPhone users. The iPhone 14 is powered by the A15 chip with 6 gigs of RAM, so as with any recent Apple Silicon, it runs very smoothly on iOS 18, and assuming Apple continues with their current practice of providing iPhones with 6 to 7 years of major iOS update support, the iPhone 14 has a minimum of 3 to 4 more years of major iOS update support remaining. So even though the iPhone 14 will continue to deliver a great iPhone experience for several more years, I actually don't recommend buying one new right now if you're in the market for an iPhone, as Apple charges $599 for the iPhone 14, which is a very high amount of money to spend on a phone that's already 2 generations old. As I said earlier, the iPhone 14 will continue to work great for several more years. However, some of the factors about this phone that are currently just minor drawbacks might start to stick out a little more as the years go by, like the fact that it has a 12 megapixel main camera lens as opposed to the higher 48 megapixel main lens, or the fact that it has a lightning port for charging and data transfer instead of a USB-C port, or even the notch area on the display instead of the dynamic island cutout area. It's not that any of these things are big problems by any means, it's just that dropping $599 on a phone that's already 2 years old with some outdated attributes isn't something that I would recommend. If you're considering buying the iPhone 14 new in 2025, I'd highly recommend spending an extra $100 to get the iPhone 15 instead at $699. Which has a lot of these improvements included, as chances are you probably want to get several years of usage out of your iPhone, and if you're prepared to spend a premium amount of money to get an iPhone, you probably don't want it to function or feel outdated after just a year or two of usage. Now, this being said, you could get an iPhone 14 in the used market for around $370 to $400, which I think is a totally fair amount of money to pay for this phone. It's actually a really good deal. So if you're looking to get a good used iPhone with solid value, the iPhone 14 is great for that, as you'll get a modern looking iPhone that performs really good and will get iOS updates for years to come for around $400. I just think Apple is overcharging for this device new in 2025. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the iPhone 14 features a lightning port for charging and data transfer, which is Apple's older proprietary charging port. Apple switched to USB-C on the next generation iPhone 15. So unfortunately, you don't have the versatility of being able to charge your iPhone 14 with the same cable you probably use to charge up your laptop and other tech in your life. Obviously, this isn't a deal breaker, just a minor downside. And as much as the iPhone's overall design style has remained largely unchanged, ranging from the iPhone 14 to the latest 16, there are a few minor differences. The back glass texture on the iPhone 14 is glossy and reflective, where on the iPhone 15 and 16 it's a matte texture. Also, the edges of the device where the glass meets the aluminum is pretty squared off on the iPhone 14, where on the iPhone 15 and 16 it's more rounded and smooth, making for a smoother feeling in the hand. And of course, the newest iPhone 16 in particular has a new vertical camera lens orientation as opposed to the horizontal camera lens orientation in the iPhone 14 and 15. At the end of the day though, other than the new iPhone 16's vertical camera lens orientation, these differences likely won't even be noticeable, as you probably use a case on your iPhone. The iPhone 14 has a 3,279 mAh battery, which is a pretty similar capacity in comparison to the newer iPhone 15 and 16. The iPhone 14 has very solid battery performance. As always though, battery performance will vary quite a bit depending on the condition of the battery in each specific iPhone 14, which depends on how many charge cycles the device has been put through, which will generally correspond with how many years of usage the device has been put through. But as long as you have an iPhone 14 with a battery in decent health, you can expect good good battery performance. If you're going to buy one of these used, definitely make sure it has a minimum of 85% battery health capacity, as an iPhone with a lower battery health than that will have significantly worse battery performance than it did when it was new. So guys, even though the iPhone 14 provides a fantastic iPhone experience in 2025 and will continue to do so for several more years, if you're in the market for a new iPhone, I don't recommend buying an iPhone 14 new in 2025, as $599 is just too much of a premium to pay for an iPhone that's 2 generations old, in my opinion, especially considering that you could get the 1 generation newer iPhone 15 for just $100 more at $699, which includes noteworthy improvements like a 48 megapixel main camera lens as opposed to the 12 megapixel one in the iPhone 14, a USB-C port instead of the older proprietary Lightning port that the iPhone 14 has, the new dynamic island style cutout at the top of the screen, a newer A16 chip that's a little bit more powerful than the A15 chip in the iPhone 14 here. All this being said though, if you're open to considering the used iPhone market, the iPhone 14 offers a fantastic value there and is actually a great iPhone to buy in 2025 used, as you could get one for around $370 to $400, which is actually a great deal. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I appreciate your time, and as always, I'll catch you in the next one.